So Rod Eddington, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Of course, you're in the business of infrastructure, of planning for the future. Are there any interesting trends you've seen emerging around the world?
I think there are some really consistent messages coming from around the developed world on the infrastructure front. I think if you look back over the last 30 or 40 years, many developed countries have underinvested in infrastructure, whether it's water infrastructure or power infrastructure or transport infrastructure. And there's a price to pay for that, and we're beginning to see some of the outcomes. A lot of the existing infrastructure is under pressure. Power blackouts or near blackouts, transport systems groaning at the seams. These are the sort of challenges we face globally.
World population is growing enormously. It's predicted within 20 years, 60% of the world's population will live in major urban areas. How's the infrastructure going to cope?
And 20 years isn't very long. I mean, many of these big projects require the better part of 10 years from start to finish, given the planning needs, the design needs, the tendering needs, and then the construction needs. Many of these major infrastructure projects are the better part of 10 years from start to finish, to the beginning of the project to the cutting of the ribbon at the end of it. So 20 years isn't very long. And we're seeing cities becoming increasingly important. They're very important, particularly in service industries. And much of the developed world has an increasing focus on services. And there's a critical mass dimension to services. The fact that financial, consulting, educational, government services often wish to co-locate in major cities means that those cities themselves are under enormous pressure, and that puts real pressure on the infrastructure that serves those cities.
Then there's the need to connect these urban areas to each other as well as internally. How do we balance these investment decisions?
Some real challenges for government and the private sector, to be frank. The government often provides the overview, but increasingly I think it'll be the private sector which delivers the services, and personally I think that's a good thing. There's clearly a role for government not only in an overview sense but in delivering some of these services. But there has to be the right mix of private and public sector involvement to get the best outcomes. Cities are important, so I think about the way in which cities work, cities and their supporting regions, their needs, their infrastructure needs, including their transport needs.
There's a trend back to public funding for major infrastructure projects. Do you see this continuing for the next few years? And if so, where does the private sector fit in?
Well, my own view is that government simply won't have the resources to deliver the infrastructure we need, given that governments also have to step up to some important commitments in areas like health and education. These are very important areas too. So I think we must be much clearer about the role of the private sector, and we've got to find new ways to allow the private sector to participate in these infrastructure areas. If we don't do that, and governments are constrained in the way in which I've described, the infrastructure simply won't get built. And that means more congestion, and there's a social and an economic price to pay for that. More delays, and that's not a good thing for cities, for countries, for people.
Is the PPP dead?
Absolutely not. The PPP is an important part of the solution. I think we've learnt some valuable lessons about what does and doesn't work in public-private partnerships over the last 20 years. But we've seen plenty of examples of what does work as well as examples of what doesn't work, and we have to find ways of embracing PPPs in a way which is consistent with future investment. If we can't find a public-private partnership model that works, a lot of this infrastructure simply won't get built.
We're still in a post-GFC world. As you say, a lot of the pressure has to go back to private enterprise to fund these projects. What are the immediate challenges finding finance today?
Clearly it's much more difficult to get financing today than it did 3 years ago. But the brutal facts of life are that there will always be economic cycles, no matter what people say. There will be periods when the global economy is robust and growing strongly. There will be periods when it's going backwards, and we've just seen a couple of very difficult years. The bottom line is economic cycles will come and go, but the demand for infrastructure is ongoing. So we've got to find a way to finance infrastructure which recognises that it'll be easier to finance some of these projects in the good times than it will in the bad.
And with our cities getting bigger and bigger, higher density is put forward as one solution, and that of course means major new infrastructure, new expanded metro systems, all with a long lead time. How do we manage everybody's expectations?
There's no doubt that given the role of cities now and into the future, and given the focus on an urban lifestyle, that the question of urban densities is critical. And I, for one, support the view that we'll see increasing urban densities, and personally think that's a good thing. Higher urban densities may well mean that the carbon cost for each individual diminishes. There are others who can speak with more authority than me on that. But I take the view we'll see greater urban densities in inner cities. That's got implementation challenges. It also has implications for things like public transport and energy and water services. I think they're deliverable, but they're going to require substantial investment.
Looking at sustainable infrastructure, there's always a clear economic driver behind these projects, but what about the environmental and social aspects? Will they be drivers as well in the future?
Governments, as they think about infrastructure requirements, as they think about the way in which people live their lives, will obviously have sustainability as a core driver. And they'll look at the carbon implications of different lifestyle choices. And if there's a price on carbon, I believe there will be at some stage. It'll help us make economic decisions which are consistent with the environmental decisions. And also there's the important question of how communities wish to live and operate. That's an important issue as well. So it's not just about economics, it's not just about sustainability, it's about the sort of lifestyle choices people make. But governments will need to reflect on all three, and that makes it a more complicated problem. But the problem doesn't go away just because it's complicated. We've got to get our head around those issues. We've got to make the right choices.
Is it possible to have social and environmentally friendly, high density inner urban development?
I believe it is. I think we're seeing that here. I think people, if given a choice, particularly younger people or individuals or couples who don't have children or have children have left home, will often choose to live a very different sort of lifestyle to the sort of lifestyle they may have lived when they had young families and wished to be out in the suburbs with a backyard. We're seeing that today, and the quality of inner city living can be extremely good. I've, different times of my life, lived in Seoul, in Tokyo and Hong Kong, all cities with very high urban densities, and I enjoyed living in all three. So I think you can live in the inner city, you can live a high-rise type of lifestyle and enjoy your life enormously.
So from your experience, what's the key to turning a good infrastructure plan into reality?
I think here in Australia particularly, there's an understanding that you need a framework, a planning framework, and you need a plan which provides a framework so that individual projects can be assessed in the context of that plan. If you're going to build a piece of rail infrastructure or road infrastructure, if you're going to increase the size of the electricity grid, how does that fit into the whole? It's a really important issue. Otherwise you find yourself taking one-off decisions which may appear to make sense in the context of that piece of the jigsaw, but don't make sense in the broader jigsaw. I think it's very important to have an overall plan to help you assess the priorities. The question I would ask for all of us is, how do we contribute to the public debate? How do we put forward issues and ideas? So how do we help government get the policy framework right? At the end of the day, I think we should leave the politics to the politicians, but I think there's a real opportunity for world-class companies like SKM to not only think through the issues, but then, having done it, to participate in the public debate so that we make the right decisions.
Congestion charging was seen as a way of controlling inner city traffic. Has that process failed, and have we moved on to more of a user pays system?
I think the whole issue of congestion charge, user charge, is one that's just beginning to come forward, particularly in the road usage sense. We've seen it in parts of Europe, we'll see it here in Australia, I think, when the Henry Tax Review was launched, although I'm not sure of the detail of that. I think what's pretty clear is that building new roads is going to be increasingly difficult in urban environments. The focus will be on public transport, and as urban densities increase, I think we'll see a greater focus on urban rail, and that's a good thing. So one of the questions is, how do we make best use of the existing roads, and where we build new roads, how do we pay for them? And I think that will inevitably raise the question of congestion charging of one form or another. And that's going to be a difficult debate to have. It's an important debate.
So Rod, you have a view on the importance of international gateways to the economic viability and sustainability of our major cities. Why are they so important?
I think international gateways are really important not only to the national economy but to our sense of community. And when I think about international gateways, I think about our ports and our airports primarily. They're critical not only for export but also for imports. And for trading nations like Australia, Great Britain and others, our international gateways really matter. And they matter not just for resources or for our agriculture and for manufacturing, they also matter for service industries. Australia's third and fourth biggest export earners are education and tourism respectively. And clearly they rely overwhelmingly on our airports and in some cases our ports as well. So getting the international gateways working effectively and integrated into the rest of the economy and the community is key. That means we need to reflect on the way in which our road and rail networks link into our ports and airports to serve them. We need to think about the way in which we use intelligent technology to help our ports and our airports function more effectively, what sort of productivity improvements we can make at both. These are really important to the national economy, but they're also really important to the way in which our community functions because they are our lifelines to the wider world.
So Rod, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you talking to Achieve magazine.
Thank you very much.